Some phone calls do not just bring bad news, they completely divide your life into a permanent before and after. For me, that moment arrived on a Tuesday evening when the pediatrician explained that my 3-year-old daughter, Abigail, had a severe blood condition requiring a specialized procedure. The clinic demanded $82,000 upfront because our insurance labeled the therapy as experimental and refused to cover it. Desperate and weeping, I immediately called my parents, begging for a loan of even $10,000 to secure her placement on the treatment list. My father cleared his throat, his tone flat and distant, as he explained that they simply could not spare a single penny because things were incredibly tight for them. My mother chimed in on the speakerphone, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy as she warned me that family members should never put one another in such uncomfortable financial positions. I ended the call and sat on the kitchen floor for an hour, staring blankly at the colorful finger paintings Abigail had taped to the refrigerator. The warmth of the phone was still fading in my hand, but the cold realization of my parents' complete indifference was already setting in deep. I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation, realizing that the people who raised me were perfectly willing to watch my child suffer rather than offer a helping hand. The true depth of their betrayal did not fully register until 6 weeks later, during a Sunday dinner that I forced myself to attend. My younger brother, Donald, stood up at the table and proudly announced that he had just signed the papers on a massive 4-bedroom house with a finished basement and a huge backyard. When I quietly asked how he managed such a massive down payment on his modest salary, my mother beamed with pride, announcing that she and my father had given him the entire sum as a gift. They did not expect a single dollar back, portraying it as a well-deserved kickoff for his future, completely ignoring that they had claimed to be broke just a month prior. I did not scream, throw my plate, or make a scene in front of the family, because the shock physically paralyzed my vocal cords. Instead, I sat silently at the wooden table, doing the agonizing mental math of how many times over that gift could have saved my little girl. The betrayal felt like a physical weight crushing my chest, making it difficult to breathe as my parents toasted to my brother's bright future. I looked at Donald, who was smiling broadly, completely oblivious to the fact that his new hardwood floors and spacious lawn were paid for with the money that could have rescued his niece. After that dinner, I went into survival mode and exhausted every possible avenue to raise the remaining $82,000 on my own. I sold my reliable car for a fraction of its value, took out a dangerous secondary loan on my modest townhouse, and launched an online donation campaign. Total strangers who did not even know Abigail's middle name managed to pool together $11,000, but the clock was ticking far too fast. Despite my frantic, sleepless efforts, the strict medical window for the specialized therapy slammed shut before I could secure the full amount. Abigail passed away quietly in her hospital bed just 4 months after that initial phone call with my parents. Standing at her funeral, I watched my mother and father weep loudly, their faces twisted in what looked like genuine, deep heartbreak. It was a sickening sight that made me realize how easily people can compartmentalize their own cruelty to protect their self-image. They mourned the grandchild they had effectively sentenced to death, while simultaneously feeling proud of the son they had pampered with a suburban estate. My brother Donald stood beside them, looking uncomfortable in his dark suit, never once making eye contact with me as the small white casket was lowered into the earth. In the 3 years that followed my daughter's passing, I built an impenetrable emotional fortress around myself to survive the lingering grief. I still showed up to major holiday gatherings because I refused to give them the satisfaction of calling me bitter or dramatic, but I remained a ghost. Donald spent those dinners complaining about the cost of maintaining his lawn or bragging about his brand new home theater system, entirely unbothered by the source of his wealth. During this period, I channeled my anger into my career, becoming a certified paralegal specializing in estate planning and trust administration. I spent my days analyzing how wealthy families secure their fortunes, write relatives out of wills, and legally protect their assets from those they deem unworthy. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang at 11 o'clock on a rainy Thursday night, and my mother's trembling voice filled the receiver. She sounded exactly the way I had sounded 3 years prior, panicked and desperate, as she explained that Donald had suddenly collapsed at his office. The doctors discovered he was suffering from acute organ failure, and his condition was deteriorating so rapidly that he needed an immediate transplant to survive. Because the National Donor Registry had no immediate matches, the medical staff urged the family to test close biological relatives. My mother pleaded with me, her voice cracking as she reminded me that as his only sibling, I was his absolute best chance at survival. I drove to the medical center that night, not because I had forgiven anyone, but because my moral compass prevented me from ignoring a dying person. The intensive care waiting room was painted in the exact same sterile, depressing gray tones that I remembered from Abigail's final weeks on Earth. The familiar, pungent smell of hospital sanitizer washed over me, instantly triggering memories of the plastic chairs where I had wept alone. The moment I walked through the double doors, my mother dropped her purse, rushed across the linoleum floor, and grabbed my hands. She squeezed them tightly, begging me to agree to the compatibility test, crying that I was the only person left who could save her son. I looked down at her manicured hands gripping mine, remembering with vivid clarity how those same hands had pushed me away when Abigail was dying. I thought about my daughter's tiny, cold fingers in that hospital room, and how a fraction of Donald's housing gift would have bought her a lifetime. I slowly pulled my hands out of her grasp, adjusted the strap of my purse over my shoulder, and prepared to speak. My voice was incredibly calm, free of anger or hesitation, as I prepared to deliver the boundary they had forced me to build. Before I could speak, the double doors swung open, and a tired-looking doctor stepped out with a medical clipboard in his hands. He looked at our tense group, assuming my presence meant a solution had been found, and asked if I was ready to begin the donor screening. My mother looked at me with wide, hopeful eyes, nodding eagerly as if the decision had already been made for me. I looked the doctor straight in the eye and stated clearly that I would not be participating in any medical testing. I explained that I was only there to visit my brother as a sister, but I was absolutely not a donor candidate. The silence that blanketed the hallway was incredibly heavy, far thicker than the quiet that followed the news of my daughter's passing. My mother's jaw dropped, her face turning a pale, ghostly white as she clutched her chest and struggled to find her voice. She whispered that I could not possibly mean what I was saying, accusing me of letting my brother die out of pure spite. I looked at her calmly and replied that I knew exactly what death looked like, having watched my own child fade away while they prioritized real estate. My father tried to step in, using his practiced, authoritative voice to claim that their past financial situation was far more complicated than I understood. I cut him off instantly, asking why those complications only applied to my dying daughter, while Donald received a massive, unneeded estate. Neither of them could offer an answer, their eyes darting away in shame as the weight of their past decisions finally caught up to them. Sensing the immense family trauma unfolding, the doctor excused himself quietly, sliding back through the double doors to give us privacy. My mother grabbed my arm tightly, her nails digging into my jacket as she screamed that I was cold, heartless, and consumed by hatred. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my sleeve, looking at her with complete emotional detachment. I told her that if I hated them, I would not have driven to the hospital at midnight just to sit in this waiting room. I was willing to offer my presence and support, but my physical body was no longer an asset this family could negotiate with or exploit. I explained that grief does not simply vanish just because their preferred child was suddenly facing an urgent medical crisis of his own. Donald's wife eventually stepped out of the patient room, her face pale and exhausted from listening to our muffled argument through the thin walls. She quietly asked if there was anything she could do to change my mind, her voice completely devoid of the anger my parents possessed. I looked at her with genuine sympathy and explained that this decision was about survival, not a petty desire for revenge. My family had spent years showing me that my daughter and I were completely expendable, and I could not sacrifice my health for them now. I sincerely hoped Donald would find a compatible donor, because I would not wish the agony of losing a loved one on my worst enemy. But obligation and love are entirely different things, and I was finally strong enough to stop letting my parents manipulate my sense of duty. In the end, Donald did survive, finding a compatible organ match through a distant cousin who lived several states away and knew nothing of our drama. I visited his recovery room once, sitting quietly by his bed for 20 minutes just to show him that I was glad he made it through. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and apologized for his years of silence, admitting he should have spoken up about the money. It did not erase the past, nor did it bring Abigail back, but it was the first time anyone in my family acknowledged my pain. Today, my relationship with my parents is practically non-existent, and I no longer force myself to attend uncomfortable holiday dinners just to keep up appearances. I spend my weekends visiting Abigail's grave, bringing yellow wildflowers that look exactly like the happy houses she used to draw on our refrigerator. I have finally come to realize that true family is not defined by shared blood, but by the people who stand by you when it costs them something. My parents showed me exactly who they were when they refused to help my daughter, and I have finally stopped waiting for them to change.